Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around with us. My name is Molly, and that's not a joke.
My name is Chris Hendershot.
And we're here today to talk with you about a project we've been working on with an NGO called Mali Nyeta. We've been working with them to assess water management strategies and agricultural alternatives over the past couple months. So this image, just to start off, is an image of some young girls in Africa carrying water on their heads. Oftentimes, in arid climates, such as the Sahel, where our site is located, women and girls end up carrying water on their heads from clean sources of water, or transporting it in some way to wherever it's needed, their family compounds, clinics, and elsewhere. And this consumes a lot of time. So we're going to get back to that in a moment. Mali Nyeta is a foundation for education in Mali, West Africa. Their mission is the development of education in Mali, West Africa, and they're helping realize the vision of several experienced educators that are from Mali and already doing groundwork there. So you might start to begin to ask, okay, education, this makes sense, but why are you doing water, and why are you doing agriculture strategies? Well, it turns out that there's really a complex web that feeds into education and it working, and it involves basic needs being addressed. This web really explains the problems that are faced by the villages that we've heard. There's a very high infant mortality rate, there's a lack of access to clean water, there's a very young marriage age for women, and there's a lack of education, so it's all interconnected, and the place that Mali Nyeta sees themselves fitting into this, at least as I understand, is education. But they also see the systemic issues at hand and think, how can we begin to address those so education can even work? So we started to break these down and consider how could we foster a space that supports education or improve infrastructure, and break down from those even further opportunities or goals from these problems that we identified. And then we started to look at possible spatial connections, because we're landscape planners and designers, we aren't engineers, and we aren't inventing a new water system. So we had to figure out where can we fit into this complex web as well. That all goes back to these issues. How could we address them? And we really identified infrastructure, circulation and flow as really important elements that we could address the water issues through. So lack of clean access to water is an issue in these villages. There is only one closed well, which you can see illustrated on the left. That's what a closed well is. The open well is an issue because animals fall into it and they die and they carry diseases, and even children can fall into the well. And they're quite dangerous and quite unsanitary.
So illustrating, these are the villages that we're working with, Djangila Kita and Djangila Fula. So for women in Fula, the only closed well is all the way down in Kita, and that is at least a kilometer-and-a-half walk daily just to get the water you need.
Lack of access to clean water is time-consuming, as we said earlier, and that can prevent people from getting education. It also, diseases are spread through the unsanitary drinking water. The village's infant mortality rate is approximately 3 out of 10. And 4 out of 10 kids in Mali die before their 5th birthday. This is a really very sobering numbers. And I think going forward we had to realize we can't do everything, but what can we do? We talked with many experts because we realized that they have had much more experience in things like this. So one of them is Don Manning, the retired CEO of Agris International, a company that's lifted over 10,000, or an organization that's lifted over 10,000 people out of rural poverty in Latin America. And he told us the most difficult thing is getting people to change their behavior. Think of how difficult it is for us to even change our own behavior. These people are risking their whole lives by shifting their land practices. Trust has to be there. So you have to really think very heavily about what land practices we're proposing, and really make sure that it's the people's design as well. So this is a network of experts that we've been talking through throughout the semester. People from permaculture experts to people that have lived and worked in Mali, just to get a better feeling about the culture and the space. We also had this incredible task of figuring out how to do the research for these small remote villages in Africa, when a lot of the data is on a very large global or regional scale. One thing that emerged from all our analyses was a region of transition, the transition zone of the Sahel, the transition zone of the cultures in Africa, and also the transitioning of the space in Djangila Kita and Djangila Fula, the 2 villages that we're looking at. This is Madam Bintu, a director from Mali Nyeta, laying the cornerstone of a health center that was constructed in 2014, and this area is really important to get clean water to so that it can function.
So zooming out a little bit, we are going to look at the Sahel landscape and where it fits in within the African continent. The villages are located, as Mali said, in a transition region. Just to the north lies the Sahara Desert. It's very hot, arid, minimum vegetation. The site lies in the region known as the Sahel. It's a transition region between desert and savanna. So this is a dry climate. It has wet and dry seasons, and there's just small patches of vegetation, but slightly larger. And then to the south of the site is the forest savanna that comprises most of Africa. Looking a little bit closer in at the Sahel, this is an image of landscape near Quito, which is a town 23 kilometers to the north. We see a variety of land use, or not land use, just vegetational patterns and land patterns. There's bare ground, there's grassy understory, and then there's more denser forest, and it's a mixed gradient. The grass extends into the forest and vice versa, and it's just just a spectrum. So taking that, try to understand the savanna as a system is important for us going forward, because that's the environment that we're working within. So this is very general, broad. This image is from northern Kenya. The patch dynamic theory defines a savanna as a shifting mosaic of shifting patch mosaic of grasses and trees. So you can think about it like this. So you see there's grassland, and then there's patches of woody vegetation, grasslands, and over time, when disturbances come through, like fire or human settlement or animals grazing, those get shifted. The conditions get altered, so they move across the landscape. And over time, they will cycle back on themselves, changing spots, refertilizing the land, and that's the natural healthy cycle of a savanna. It's constantly in flux. Within that system, fire plays a big role. 50% of savannas burn on a yearly basis. So this map is a NASA image, a composite image showing the density or frequency of fire types within Africa over a 4-month period. And our site is highlighted in a purple dot. And we're just wondering if, as climate change continues to impact Africa, if that fire belt could move north.
This region is also has a decent amount of biodiversity, especially with birds being kind of a regional ecotone. There are 146 species of mammals, and mammals such as the Western African giraffe, shown in the bottom corner over there, are no longer even in Mali. They've been moved out by desertification. There's also been over 622 species of birds recorded in 16 important bird areas in Mali, and those are really important areas. There are about 10,000 of those worldwide. Habitat loss is a serious issue that we need to consider when looking at the landscape. And desertification is a major factor in the habitat loss. Desertification is just land degradation in arid and semi-arid and dry subhumid regions resulting from various factors. Livestock is one of the many factors that kind of contributes to the landscape becoming more arid. There's also an important connection with reforestation and deforestation within the dynamics of desertification. This is an image of the site with the vegetation isolated. There are no signs of tiger brush. Tiger brush is really an early indicator of desertification. When you look at satellite imagery, you can see that plants start to form these almost tiger-like stripes on the contours of the landscape. So that's really helpful looking at this, and you can start to think, what can we do to maybe halt the process within this area. This reveals where we should also look at different factors such as water and soils and development within the landscape just by differences in vegetation.
So just to acknowledge the historical context, Mali, the region that we're working in, was once part of many different empires that had advanced knowledge of astronomy, art, and math. From 1880 to 1960, Mali was a French colony. It was part of French Guinea. And this has a lasting legacy that still impacts daily life in many ways. The political boundaries, for instance, are remnants of that. The language, French, is one of the predominant languages. Land management practices and larger economic systems, they all have carry on the legacy from the colonial period.
So climate change is big discussion of the region with desertification. Summer rains are 12% below the 1920 to 1969 averages, and temperatures have increased by almost a whole degree Celsius since 1975. One of the effects that we have to consider with this is that that's really going to intensify the effects of drought, and also when we're thinking about land management and water strategies within the landscape, how can we make sure that we can retain water or use the small amounts of water that go into the landscape efficiently. The rain means that people live. This is from Monique and Mangarines, one of the books that we read throughout the term to kind of get a better understanding of the space. Rain is really important to people, and understanding its connection culturally and also to the crops that are being grown within the villages is really important.
What are the precipitation levels?
Pardon?
How much rain?
In Kita, which is approximately, I think, 23 miles north of the villages, there are an average of 911 millimeters per year. So, and it mostly falls between June and October. So the soils are alpha soils, which just means they have a lot of aluminum, they have a lot of iron, they're fairly rich, they're often found under hardwood forest cover. We have to consider that when we're looking in the landscape at the different vegetation that's currently existent. Something that was really interesting when we started doing the analyses was the so whats that you've been hearing about all day, like this great southeastern corner of the property that we love so much in New England really might not be that great. And the northwestern corner might be great for us, the aspect to protect plants from the really intense heat that can get up to close to 125 degrees sometimes. Also, something as basic as the rural to urban transect that we use so much in planning in the United States doesn't fit with the cities from what we looked at in satellite imagery and looking around. We have to think about this when we're thinking about development, perhaps along the Bakoi River in the future, which is right near the two villages. How is this development occurring, especially without cars within the landscape? So going into the people of Fulala and Kita, this is just an image that shows Joe Donovan, an architect, Jonathan Ellison from the Conway School, and a director of an elementary school in Bamako that's been really involved with Mali Nyeta and some other people.
So zooming into the people of the villages we're working with, they both come from two ethno-linguistic family groups that have separate lineages and histories, each with a population of 30 million approximately. And both of those groups are spread across many different countries, and they don't comprise a majority in any of the countries they live in, meaning that they don't really have not necessarily representative political representation. And both of these groups are of Muslim faith.
Looking at the two different villages, which both each are one of these different kind of ethno-linguistic groups, the Mendenge and the Fula, we looked at the spatial arrangements of even their buildings, the amount and distribution, and you can start to see differences in the landscape between the villages, such as Djangla Kita, the buildings are much more clustered into family units, whereas in Djangla Fula, the buildings are much more centrally dispersed, and this is kind of manifested in the way that they work too. From what we've heard, Djangla Fula is very business-oriented, and Djangla Kita is very family-oriented, and this kind of plays out throughout their relations. Roads and paths are a huge concern when thinking about the space, kind of thinking about how people use the landscape. These were all organically created roads and paths that reveal plausible routes of least resistance and important features in the landscapes that we should be looking for when we're walking around, ground truthing this information. There's differences in village layouts that can be seen in the circulation routes, and it's important for relating water, as we've talked about, and water management strategies to people and how they get water from the closed well to other places where it's in need.
So agriculture in Mali is a huge, it's the majority of their national GDP, 80%. The biggest export crops are cotton and livestock. Although most Malayan farmers are subsistence farmers, which that means you're growing the food to feed your family directly from your land. So it just adds another level of seriousness to agriculture. Here's an example of the cotton harvest. A lot of it is still done by hand. And here's an example of a peanut grinder operation in a small village. Peanuts are a big crop, a traditional crop in Mali.
The agriculture in the landscape, from what we've heard, is mostly, the villagers mostly grow millet, peanuts, and maize. There's a woman's garden in the Djangla Fulala. It's the only place where vegetables are currently grown. It's one of those two dots around that area. Cotton is grown in some fields outside of the village as well. Fencing helps keep food in. That was really important when considering, is it keeping livestock in or is it keeping food in? We found out that it keeps the food and the livestock out, and the livestock freely roam throughout the land, essentially. Annual crop fields are allocated on a yearly basis at the discretion of the chief to individual families, so that's how the land ownership works within the space for them.
So going forward, we are asking ourselves, how are we going to collect information on agriculture, meaning that it's such an important part of our project? How can we help facilitate the process to create a more functional landscape? For instance, this is an example of a maize field after plowing, and that is found just to the south of the site, about 200 kilometers. And then here's an example from another one of the case studies we've been looking at of an agroforestry system. And likewise down here, as is in our site, most of the gardens, all of them are hand watered. And then down here, if the land has been engineered to just do it for us. So going forward, we're looking at water management details. What are the microclimates, the terrain specifics, drainage, sunlight, soil conditions, keeping different cultural considerations in mind, economic viability, cultural relativity, future development in the region, and different methods that we're thinking about collecting data with. Since we're leaving for Mali the day after tomorrow. So we're observation, documentation, interviewing, mapping are all on the agenda.
So this was a way that before we even go over there that we figured we could collect data about the space, because it's really difficult when looking at this small resolution in this remote of an area. So we built an interactive base map that we worked with our client and a couple other people that she connected with from the area, and together we created this map, which reveals the family compounds in essential areas like the health clinic, a pool hut, which is kind of like a bodega, where the mosque was, where the closed well was, open concrete lined wells. This was a really interesting way of gathering data about the site that we can now go take and look at and use as a base map when we go over there to work with. A hydrology report was completed in March 2015. It turns out that Mali Nyeta is over an aquifer, and this just shows, generally speaking, where an existing closed well is. Should be right here. It's about 200 meters south of where the health clinic was recently built, and this light blue dot shows where the well site was recommended from the hydrology report for the future. So flow and circulation with the health clinic is pretty set with that location, but we have to think about how people are going to travel to there from the other villages. So going into this kind of massive amount of information and thinking about how we can understand what our job is to do, how we can determine the feasibility of water quality management methods and agricultural strategies, we decided to go in by creating a structured framework of like a classification schema using case studies that kind of informed what the classifications were for different water management strategies, agriculture strategies, and irrigation systems. So to do this, we looked at the site context and existing conditions, and then the case studies, the existing conditions and context of each of the case studies was examined next to the site, and we conditions, and we asked what worked, what failed, why, and what is different about the case studies locations and our sites. These are the locations of the case studies we've looked at and integrated into this grid so far. So you can see that many of them are in West Africa, but there are some abroad that really are in more similar socio-economic circumstances and less similar with climate. So it's really interesting to think about if those could work.
So just going forward, here's an example of one of those case studies that we've been looking at in depth. Ecova Mali is a nonprofit organization that does agroforestry research and education. They're actually based in Massachusetts. So this is an example of one of their agroforestry systems, a diversity of crops intermixed to try to hold water into the dry landscape. Notice how dry it is in the back. This site is about 200 kilometers to the southeast of our site, and we are really hoping to take a visit.
So agroforestry, just quickly for again these questions, is really, we consider it something that could be really valuable in the landscape because it can help recharge the aquifer, and that's a concern, especially with the climate becoming more arid in the area. And moving forward, the agroforestry is just one of these typologies that we've grouped all the case studies under, based on how they're being worked into the landscape. So we're going to Mali the day after tomorrow, and we're going with a lot more questions than answers. We're wondering, is this the right project to be doing in this place? You always have to be asking, I think, that essential question. We're wondering, are we the right people to be doing it still? How can we fit into it? How does what we know about the region relate to the villages? How does all this regional information scale down, and how can we relate that to the area? How should we be aware of our own ignorance going into this really foreign place? Advice about information we should gather in Mali, or methods for information gathering that you may know of that may be of use, is more than welcome as well. And if there are different ways to work with villagers from 2 different ethno-linguistic groups, we don't know if this is going to pose a challenge yet. We do know that they get along, but we don't know what quite is going on culturally based on those ethno-linguistic groups, if there are challenges. And how should we refine the overall structure of how we're addressing the goals is also something we're interested in understanding a bit more. So, thank you.